I've been a forest ranger for most of my life. I've seen some things that still haunt me, but nothing compares to what happened when I was sent on that mission to the Alaskan mountains. I thought I knew what I was getting into. After all, I'd dealt with predators before. But this was different. Far different. It started innocently enough. I was given the task of locating and eliminating cryptids that were causing havoc in the Alaskan wilderness. The reports had been coming in for months, strange sightings of creatures that no one could identify. To be honest, I didn't believe the stories. The Alaskan wilderness is vast, unpredictable, and people see strange things in the isolation of its rugged terrain. But when the call came in, my superiors insisted I investigate. So, I packed my gear and went. I was told the cryptids were becoming a threat to nearby settlements, and it was my job to stop them. The journey up to the mountains was grueling. I'd been in Alaska before, but nothing quite like this. The landscape was colder, darker, and eerily silent. The deeper I ventured into the wilderness, the more I felt like I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The cold, the isolation, the weight of the task ahead, but the feeling never went away. My team consisted of a few experienced rangers, seasoned in handling dangerous wildlife. We were well equipped, armed to the teeth, and prepared for whatever the wilderness could throw at us. But the deeper we went, the more we realized we weren't just dealing with wild animals. We were dealing with something otherworldly. The first encounter happened at night. We had set up camp, keeping a low profile. Suddenly, there was a noise from the woods, something large moving. We thought it was a bear, but as we looked through the scope, we saw something that wasn't a bear at all. It was tall, far too tall. It moved with a fluid grace that didn't belong to anything in nature. Its eyes, glowing in the dark, locked onto mine, and for a split second, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature's gaze seemed to pierce through me. I ordered my team to remain calm, but inside, my heart was racing. We waited, and just when I thought we were safe, it vanished into the shadows. That night, none of us slept. We knew something was out there, something we didn't understand. The next day, we tracked it down. The landscape was covered in deep, unnatural tracks, far larger than any animal's footprints. But it wasn't just the size that unnerved us. It was the fact that the tracks appeared to vanish into thin air, as though the creature was capable of disappearing without a trace. We combed the area for days, following its path, but it was like the thing was playing with us, leading us deeper into the wilderness. On the third day, we encountered it again, this time face to face. The creature stood on two legs, towering over us. Its features were grotesque, part man, part beast, and part something that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The air grew colder, and the forest around us fell unnervingly silent. My team was frozen in place, too terrified to act. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but I knew I couldn't. We had a mission to complete. The cryptid snarled at us, its mouth filled with sharp teeth that gleamed like knives in the moonlight. It was intelligent, too intelligent, and it knew exactly what we were there for. We raised our weapons, but the creature was faster than we could react. In an instant, it lunged at one of my men. The scream that followed still echoes in my ears. I don't know what happened next. My mind was clouded with fear, and in that chaos, everything blurred together. I remember pulling the trigger, but the creature didn't die. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned its attention back to us, its rage now fully awakened. It was like we were the prey, and it was hunting us down. We ran, but no matter how fast we moved, the thing was always one step ahead. One by one, my team was picked off. I watched helplessly as my friends were dragged into the shadows, their screams swallowed by the night. It wasn't until I found myself alone, trapped in a narrow canyon with nowhere to run, that I realized I wasn't going to make it out. The creature cornered me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine again, and I could feel it in my bones, the malevolent presence of something ancient and evil. I tried to raise my weapon, but my hands were shaking. My mind was clouded, consumed by the terror of knowing I was about to die. But then something changed. The creature stopped, staring at me as though it was waiting for something. I don't know what possessed me in that moment, but I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just an animal. This was something that had been there long before humanity ever set foot in these mountains. It wasn't just hunting for food, it was hunting for vengeance. With everything inside me screaming to run, I realized I was already too far gone. The creature, I understood now, wasn't just a cryptid. It was a guardian of the land, punishing those who dared to intrude upon its sacred territory. And now it had its revenge. The last thing I remember was the creature's eyes, glowing brighter than the sun, before everything went dark. I don't know how I made it out of those mountains alive. The creature never finished what it started, but the memory of its eyes will haunt me for the rest of my days. I've left the rangers behind, unable to forget what I saw. The Alaskan wilderness is not a place for men like me. And the cryptids, they aren't just myths. They're guardians, and we're nothing but intruders. If you ever hear stories about the Alaskan cryptids, believe them. Because the price for ignoring the warnings is steep, and I'm living proof of that. I had been a forest ranger for most of my life, trained to handle the harsh conditions of the wilderness and deal with its many unpredictable dangers. But nothing could prepare me for the strange and terrifying mission I would undertake in the Alaskan wilderness. To anyone who hadn't been there, Alaska is just another rugged, untouched landscape, a haven for nature lovers, wildlife enthusiasts, and those seeking a bit of solitude. But for those who have ventured deep into its heart, it's much more than that. The wilderness holds secrets that few can comprehend, and even fewer can survive. Before I was called for this mission, I had spent over a decade patrolling various parts of North America. I had seen bears, wolves, and other dangerous wildlife up close, but nothing could have prepared me for the dark forces lurking in the Alaskan wilderness. There's a special kind of silence in Alaska, one that sinks deep into your bones and makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you know you are. It's a silence that presses in on you, heavy and oppressive. And it's during that silence that the forest becomes a different place, a place where the world seems to bend and warp. That's when you know you're being watched. The cryptids, those half-glimpsed creatures, half legendary, half real, were the reason I'd been sent there. No one knew what they were for sure, only that they existed. And they were dangerous. When I received the call from headquarters, I was told they had become a threat to the small towns that dotted the outskirts of the Alaskan wilderness. Something needed to be done. At first, I didn't question the decision. As a ranger, I'd faced dangerous situations before, though nothing quite like this. The idea of dealing with cryptids didn't even faze me. I figured they were simply elusive creatures, maybe Bigfoot-like beings or just wild, unclassified animals, no different from the bears I was used to tracking. But as soon as I got on the ground in Alaska, everything felt different. The very air felt heavier, and the trees loomed overhead, their twisted limbs looking like unnatural sentinels. The team I was assigned to included 4 other rangers, seasoned professionals who had seen their fair share of weirdness in the wilderness. But even they had an air of unease about them. I noticed how they moved with more caution than usual, constantly looking over their shoulders, scanning the treeline as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. This wasn't normal. These men weren't scared of wildlife. They were scared of something else. As we made our way deeper into the Alaskan wilderness, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The landscape was stark and alien. High cliffs that rose like walls, endless stretches of dense forest, and a never-ending twilight that made it feel like the sun was never truly up or down. It was as though time itself didn't work in Alaska, and it was in this strange, timeless place that the real horrors began to show themselves. The first sign that something was wrong came on the second day. We had set up camp near a small river that we thought would give us a good vantage point, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, we started to hear the sounds, low, guttural growls coming from the woods. The noise was distant, but its resonance was enough to make my skin crawl. The rangers tried to brush it off, saying it was probably a bear or wolf, but the growls were too deep, too unnatural, to be anything of the kind. At nightfall, we huddled closer together. The campfire felt weaker than usual, its flames flickering as if struggling against something unseen. The sounds grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the wind stopped completely, and the forest was plunged into an eerie silence. That was when we saw it. A shape moving between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, its movements almost fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. Its eyes, glowing faintly, seemed to pierce through the darkness. My mind raced. I thought it could have been a bear, or maybe some other wild animal, but the creature was so tall. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its silhouette was unnerving, inhuman. I should have listened to my instincts then, but instead, I did what any seasoned ranger would do. I grabbed my rifle and aimed. And that was the first mistake I made. The creature didn't run, it didn't even flinch. It simply stood there watching us. And then it was gone, vanished into the trees, as though it had never been there at all. I don't know why, but something told me then that we weren't dealing with anything natural. This wasn't some strange animal, this was something else entirely. As the days wore on, the feeling of being watched never left. It was always there, a gnawing sensation in the back of my mind. We continued to track the cryptids, But every time we thought we had found something, the tracks would vanish, as if they had been erased from existence. It was maddening, like we were walking through a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. I realized then that this mission wasn't just about hunting cryptids. It was about something much darker. The cryptids weren't just animals or strange creatures. They were guardians of something ancient, something we weren't meant to understand. They were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. And as I would soon learn, they would never stop hunting us, no matter how far we ran. As the days passed, I started to wonder if we had become part of the hunt ourselves. The cryptids weren't just protecting the land. They were protecting something more. Something old, something powerful. And we were the trespassers. The wilderness itself seemed alive with this force, as if it was willing us to leave. And, despite all my training, despite my experience in the wild, I began to realize that this was one mission I might not come back from. The Alaskan wilderness wasn't just home to creatures. It was home to a forgotten primal energy. Something older than humanity, something that didn't want us there. The cryptids were just the manifestation of that force, and I, foolishly, had walked right into its territory. The days after we first encountered the cryptid were filled with a tension I hadn't felt before. It was as though the entire wilderness had shifted, and we were no longer just intruders, we were prey. The men I was with, normally the toughest and most fearless of rangers, started to show cracks in their composure. The usual banter had quieted, replaced by nervous glances and the sound of boots shuffling nervously through the dirt. On the fourth day, we found something that chilled me to the bone, a body. It wasn't human, but it wasn't anything I had ever seen before either. It was large, a hulking mass with limbs that bent in odd angles, as if broken and twisted by unnatural forces. Its skin was leathery, and its eyes had been gouged out, but the rest of its face had been distorted in a grotesque fashion, as if whatever had killed it wanted to make a statement. The worst part wasn't the corpse itself, though. It was the markings around it, symbols carved into the dirt. They looked ancient, primitive, as though they had been made by a force long forgotten by humanity. They surrounded the body like a circle of protection, or perhaps a warning. The air around the scene felt charged, as if something was watching us, waiting for us to make our next move. We circled the body carefully, too afraid to touch it, too afraid to disturb anything. The tension grew with each passing hour. Every rustling leaf, every distant howl, every crack of a twig was amplified in the silence that blanketed our camp. We tried to remain calm, set up watches, and discuss our next steps, but it was clear that the forest itself was closing in on us. The cryptids weren't just hiding from us anymore, they were hunting us. And it was starting to feel like they had no intention of letting us leave alive. That night, the cryptids made their presence known. The air turned cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones, and the wind stopped altogether. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. We heard the growls again, closer this time, and this time, they weren't distant echoes. They were right outside the perimeter of our camp. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the cryptids were surrounding us. But we stayed in the camp, preparing ourselves for the worst. Then, in the dead of night, the trees began to move. I'm not talking about the natural sway of branches in the wind. This was something else entirely. The trees, thick and ancient, began to shift, almost as if they were repositioning themselves. Their trunks twisted unnaturally, and the ground seemed to ripple beneath our feet. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, so intense that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. One of the rangers, a man named Daniels, couldn't take it anymore. He bolted, running out of the camp, shouting in panic. I don't know if he thought he could outrun whatever was out there, but the sound of his frantic footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the darkness. We tried to call him back, but our voices were lost in the windless silence. The next morning, Daniels was gone. No trace of him remained, just his footprints leading into the dense forest, only to disappear without a sound. We searched for hours, but it was like the forest had swallowed him whole. It was as if the trees themselves had hidden him, and the cryptids had claimed another victim. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with a creature anymore. The wilderness itself had turned against us. The paranoia set in quickly. We began to question everything. The sounds of the forest were no longer just animal calls. They were whispers. The rustling of trees seemed like words. The flickering shadows were like eyes watching us, waiting for us to slip up. We started to argue among ourselves, distrust growing with every passing hour. Everyone had heard the growls, seen the strange movements in the trees, and felt the oppressive silence that followed. One by one, the cryptids began to reveal themselves. We would spot them briefly, these grotesque figures gliding between the trees, their long limbs twisting in impossible ways, their glowing eyes fixated on us from the shadows. There were more of them than we had initially realized, at least 4 or 5 that we could see, maybe more hidden in the thick woods, just out of sight. But it wasn't just their presence that unnerved us. It was their intelligence. They weren't mindless beasts. They were calculating, playing with us like predators toying with their prey. Every time we thought we had them cornered, every time we thought we could get a clean shot, or at least a better look at one of these creatures, it would vanish into the trees, leaving us with nothing but the chilling realization that we had been outwitted once again. One night, as I lay awake, my mind racing with the terror of the previous days, I heard something new. A voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was one of my teammates calling for help. But when I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't a human voice. It was something deeper, guttural, distorted by the thick woods. It was a whisper, a command, and it was coming from all around us. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them. The cryptids weren't just hunting us. They were speaking to us, communicating in some language I couldn't comprehend. It became clear that we weren't just in a fight for survival. We were in a battle for our very lives, pitted against a force of nature older and more powerful than anything we had ever known. The cryptids were not just creatures to be eradicated. They were guardians of something far more ancient, something that they would kill to protect. And we, foolishly, had wandered into their domain. The further we pressed into the Alaskan wilderness, the more I realized that this wasn't just a mission to track cryptids. It was a mission to challenge something that should have been left alone. And now there was no way out. As the tension around the cryptid hunt escalated, so did the complexities of our situation. We were no longer just a group of trained rangers in the wilderness. We had become part of something much darker and far more complicated than any of us had anticipated. The creatures we were hunting weren't just animals. They were guardians of something old and powerful, and we were trespassers in a place where man was never meant to tread. The first subplot revolved around the growing distrust among us. Initially, we had been a team, a unit that worked well together, communicating openly and relying on each other's skills and instincts. But with every passing day in the Alaskan wilderness, cracks began to appear in that foundation. The creatures were methodical, their presence always lingering, and as they toyed with us, they started to erode the very trust we had in one another. One of the rangers, Holt, began acting erratically. At first, it seemed like simple paranoia. After all, who wouldn't be on edge when hunted by creatures from nightmares? But Holt became obsessed. He started speaking in whispers to himself, refusing to sleep, and insisting that we were being watched by more than just the cryptids. At night, he'd stare into the darkened trees for hours, muttering under his breath. I could hear him sometimes talking to someone or something out there in the shadows. His behavior became more dangerous when he started to believe that the cryptids were trying to communicate with him. Holt began interpreting the strange markings on trees and rocks as messages, warnings, or signs. He'd crouch next to these symbols, tracing them with his fingers as though trying to unlock some ancient puzzle. He became obsessed with the idea that these cryptids were not just animals. They were connected to something greater, something much older than we could comprehend. At first, we ignored him, thinking it was just a side effect of the stress we were all under. But Holt's behavior escalated when he started claiming that he was being chosen by the cryptids to understand their purpose. The second subplot revolved around the growing realization that the cryptids weren't the only threat in the park. The mountains and dense forest had a presence of their own, something that had been there long before humanity arrived. There were reports of strange occurrences in the park going back decades. Unexplained disappearances, cryptic messages, and terrifying visions of figures in the trees. Stories were told in whispers by the locals, but they were written off as superstition or exaggeration. We, however, had started to piece together a much darker story, one that involved not just the cryptids, but the land itself. Somewhere deep in the forest, there was a legend of a forgotten, ancient tribe, one that had once worshipped these cryptid-like creatures as deities. They had revered them as protectors of the land, and in return, the cryptids had kept the tribe safe from the outside world. But over time, the tribe had vanished, leaving only their symbols and stories behind. Now, it seemed that those who had dared enter the mountains were intruding on this sacred space, and the cryptids were bent on protecting it at any cost. I had heard the stories growing up, but they had always seemed too fantastical to be true. Now, as I stood in the middle of that very same forest, I felt the weight of that legend pressing in on me. The trees no longer felt like just trees. The land beneath my feet no longer seemed like just dirt. Everything in the wilderness had become alive with meaning, and I could feel the presence of something ancient watching me. The cryptids were not just creatures to be eradicated, they were an embodiment of the land itself, its ancient will to survive. This realization only added to the complex web of emotions and tension that had taken over the team. There was no escaping the fact that the cryptids were connected to the land, and that we were trespassing on sacred ground. But as the days dragged on, we couldn't help but wonder if the cryptids were just doing their job as protectors of the land, or if they had been driven to something more primal and dangerous. Were they trying to warn us, or were they hunting us down to keep us from discovering something hidden in the mountains? The third subplot involved the complex relationship between myself and my team. As the mission leader, it was my responsibility to keep everyone together and ensure we completed our objective. But I couldn't shake the growing feeling that I had led us into a trap that was closing in on us from all sides. I had always been confident in my skills, but I began to question whether I had made the right choice in accepting the mission. I had been a forest ranger for over a decade, and I had faced plenty of danger in my career. But this was different. This wasn't just a hunt. This was survival. The creatures were too cunning, the land too unforgiving, and the weight of history too heavy. The longer we stayed, the more I could feel the decision to venture into these mountains weighing on me. As Holt grew more unstable, I found myself taking on the responsibility of trying to hold the group together. But it wasn't just Holt I had to worry about. There was a growing rift between myself and the other rangers. Some wanted to turn back, to call for help, and leave the mountains behind. Others, like Holt, were fixated on unraveling the mystery of the cryptids, convinced that there was something worth uncovering in the wilderness. These divisions only deepened the conflict within our group, pushing us further into the heart of the unknown. We were divided, and in the mountains of Alaska, that was the most dangerous state to be in. As the pressure mounted, I realized that the biggest threat we faced wasn't just the cryptids, it was ourselves. We had been brought to the brink by forces beyond our comprehension, and our only hope of survival was to reconcile our differences, understand the nature of the cryptids, and uncover the ancient secret hidden in the mountains before it was too late. But the deeper we went, the more I understood. There was no simple solution to our predicament. We had unleashed something that could never be put back, and we were now at the mercy of forces much older and more powerful than we could ever imagine. As the days stretched on in the forbidding wilderness of the Alaskan mountains, the tension between my team members became unbearable. What had started as a seemingly straightforward mission to eliminate dangerous cryptids had transformed into a nightmare where every step we took seemed to pull us deeper into a malevolent force beyond our control. At first, we had all agreed on our purpose, certain we were doing the right thing. Now, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. The turning point arrived on the 7th day of our journey, the day we lost Holt. It started with an eerie quiet that swept over the group. Normally, the Alaskan wilderness was alive with the sounds of the wind rustling through the pines, the distant calls of birds, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. But that morning, everything was still, unnaturally still. The silence was suffocating, as if the forest itself had become aware of our presence and had decided to hold its breath. Even the air felt heavier, as if every breath we took was laced with an unspoken warning. Holt had been acting more strangely than usual for the past few hours. He was muttering to himself again, but this time it was different. He wasn't simply talking about the cryptids anymore. He was chanting something, low, rhythmic words in a language none of us recognized. At first, I thought it was just his mind starting to break from the isolation and stress of the mission. But the more he chanted, the more my unease grew. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. At around noon, Holt disappeared. We were following the trail of cryptid tracks that led us further into the thick of the forest, when one moment, Holt was there, moving silently, almost too quietly ahead of us. The next moment, he was gone. One of the other rangers, Sarah, called out his name when we realized he hadn't responded to her instructions. We searched frantically, calling for him, but there was no answer. Holt had simply vanished into the trees. We split up to search for him. I knew the forest well enough to understand that in places like this, time and space often felt warped. It was easy to become disoriented in the vastness of the wilderness. But something told me that Holt wasn't just lost. He had chosen to disappear. Maybe the cryptids had gotten to him. Maybe he had followed their voices. He had spoken of hearing them, after all. I had thought it was just paranoia, but now I wondered if he had been hearing something real, something far darker than we'd anticipated. By the time we reconvened, we were all shaken. Holt's disappearance had thrown the team into disarray. Everyone was questioning what had happened. Some were convinced that Holt had gone off the deep end and wandered off on his own. Others, like Sarah and another ranger named Dean, were beginning to believe that Holt had been taken. We had heard stories of people vanishing in these mountains, of the land itself swallowing them whole. But those were just stories, weren't they? That night, as we set up camp, the air grew colder, and the forest around us seemed to close in. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer just being hunted by cryptids. There was something else in the woods now, a presence, ancient and malevolent, that seemed to be aware of our every move. In the dead of night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the team members checking the perimeter, but when I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Holt was standing at the edge of the camp. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring into the woods. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. There was something off about him, something that made me hesitate. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge me at all. He simply stood there, locked in place as if frozen by some invisible force. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. My heart began to pound. Holt wasn't right. There was something wrong in the way he stood, rigid, unblinking, as though he were being controlled by some force beyond his will. Then I heard it. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, came from the trees behind him. It wasn't human. It was guttural and ancient, a sound that scraped at the edges of my mind and sent shivers down my spine. "Holt," I said again, my voice trembling. "What happened? Where have you been?" Still, he didn't respond. But then something shifted. Holt began to walk toward the trees, his movements slow and deliberate. I rushed forward to stop him, but it was too late. With an unnatural speed, Holt darted into the shadows of the forest, vanishing into the blackness without a sound. I could feel the temperature drop even further, as if the forest had become a vacuum, sucking all warmth from the air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and rot. Something had taken Holt, something powerful, something ancient. It was then that I realized the true nature of the force we were dealing with. This wasn't just a hunt for cryptids anymore. We were in the midst of a battle with the very land itself, an ancient, vengeful force that had no intention of letting us leave unscathed. Holt's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was part of the plan. The cryptids, the strange markings, and Holt's eerie behavior were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that was about to reveal itself in ways we couldn't possibly imagine. We had crossed a line, and now the land was fighting back. The cryptids weren't just protecting the wilderness. They were guarding something far more sinister, and we had unwittingly walked into their territory, unprepared for the consequences. I knew then that Holt wasn't coming back, and if we didn't act fast, none of us would. The morning after Holt's disappearance, the air was thick with dread. The other members of my team were on edge, their faces pale and drawn, eyes darting nervously at every rustling leaf or snapping twig. Something had changed in the forest overnight, and we all felt it deep in our bones. The hunt for cryptids had morphed into something far darker, something I was no longer sure we could escape from. As we gathered around the campfire, I could see the disbelief in their eyes. No one spoke about Holt directly, but it was clear that the team was shaken. We had been trained for every possible disaster, every worst-case scenario, except for this. Holt had vanished without a trace, his mind seemingly consumed by the forest, and I could tell that no one wanted to acknowledge the truth of what had happened. The uncertainty hung in the air like a fog. Dean, the quietest of the group, was the first to break the silence. "We have to go after him," he said, his voice tight with resolve. "We can't just leave him out there." I nodded slowly, though a part of me, deep inside, knew that Holt was gone, in ways that couldn't be fixed. But I wasn't about to tell Dean that. "I'll go with you," I said, my voice low but firm. "But we need to be careful. The forest is different now." Sarah, who had always been the most rational of the group, looked at me with disbelief. "Different? What do you mean by that?" I hesitated, unsure how to put into words what had been creeping under my skin since Holt's disappearance. "Something's in the woods," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something alive." There was an uncomfortable silence as my words sank in. I could see Sarah's skepticism, but I knew she couldn't deny what had happened to Holt, not now. "We need to find him, then," she said finally, her voice edged with uncertainty but determination. The others nodded, albeit reluctantly. We packed up the camp quickly, moving with mechanical precision, the weight of Holt's disappearance hanging over us like a dark cloud. Our mission, once clear-cut, had now become a fight for survival. We weren't just hunting cryptids anymore. We were hunting for our lives. As we trudged deeper into the forest, the oppressive silence of the wilderness seemed to press in from all sides. The air was heavier, colder, and every step we took felt like we were walking deeper into the jaws of something ancient. I could almost feel the trees closing in on us, their gnarled branches like claws reaching out, threatening to ensnare us in their twisted embrace. Dean was the first to hear something, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a low, guttural growl, somewhere between an animal's snarl and the sound of something much larger, much older. We froze, listening as the growl echoed through the trees. There was no mistaking it. We were not alone. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was out there was closing in on us. I motioned for everyone to stay low and move silently. We crept forward, our senses heightened, every snap of a twig making us flinch. Then we saw it, a figure, or rather, the shadow of a figure, moving in the distance. It was tall, too tall, unnaturally tall, and its shape was distorted like a creature with limbs that bent at odd angles. I couldn't tell whether it was human or cryptid, but the air around it seemed to ripple with something wrong. Its movement was jerky and human. It wasn't walking, but dragging itself through the trees. I motioned for the group to stay back, but it was too late. The creature turned toward us, its eyes glowing like hot coals. The sight of them burned into my retinas, searing my soul. Its face was obscured in shadow, but the eyes, those glowing, burning eyes, stared directly at us, locking onto me as if it knew who I was, as if it had been waiting for me. Then, in a voice that was both human and animal, it spoke. Leave, asterisk. The word was harsh, guttural, but there was something chillingly familiar about it, something that rattled my bones. I realized, too late, that the creature wasn't talking to just us, it was talking to me. The presence of the creature, its malice in the air, sent a surge of fear through my body. I knew at that moment that this wasn't just a cryptid we were dealing with. It was a guardian, a force of nature, an ancient being bound to the forest, its protector. And it was angry. The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, no one moved. We stood frozen in place, staring at the creature, unsure whether it was about to attack or speak again. I didn't know what would happen next, but I felt it in my gut. Our lives were now in its hands. Dean took a step forward, raising his weapon. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but I could see in his eyes that he had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to back down. We're not leaving. We came for one thing, Holt, and we're not leaving until we get him. The creature didn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as though considering his words. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until the air seemed to crack under the weight of it. Then, with one swift movement, the creature lunged. Everything happened so fast. The world around me became a blur as I dove to the ground, narrowly avoiding the creature's swipe. The others scattered, their weapons raised, but I knew deep down that we were outmatched. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard Holt's voice, low, distorted, echoing through the trees. You should have left. It was too late. The creature wasn't just hunting us, it was punishing us. We were intruders, and now we would face the consequences. The forest had already claimed Holt, and now it was coming for the rest of us. The moments after the creature lunged were chaotic. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as though the forest itself was alive, moving with a purpose. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the frantic sound of footsteps as Dean and Sarah tried to regroup. But there was no time to think, no time to plan. The forest, once a place of awe and mystery, had turned into a battlefield. I pulled myself to my feet, my body aching from the fall, my breath ragged as I scanned the surroundings. The creature was fast, too fast for us to track, and its movements were so unnatural that it seemed to disappear into the trees, only to reappear in the next moment, ready to strike again. I realized then that we weren't just dealing with a cryptid. This was something far more dangerous, something far older than any of us could have imagined. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We had made a grave mistake by entering this place. The park was not just home to hidden creatures. It was the heart of something ancient, a living entity that protected its domain with an unyielding force. And it was angry. Get back, ! I shouted to the group, my voice hoarse as I grabbed Sarah by the arm, pulling her toward the makeshift shelter we had built earlier. Dean was still standing near the clearing, his weapon raised, his eyes wild with fear but determined to face the creature head-on. But there was no way to fight something like that. No way to win. We can't fight it, I yelled. It's not just a cryptid, it's the forest itself. Dean hesitated, confusion written across his face. He was a soldier, a man trained to handle threats, but this was something he couldn't understand. It wasn't just a creature, it was a force of nature. Something primal, unexplainable, and beyond our comprehension. But before I could say more, the creature reappeared in front of us, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. It was closing in, moving with a speed that left no room for escape. "We need to move," Sarah screamed, tugging at my sleeve. But I knew we couldn't outrun it, not now. The forest had already closed in around us. There was no way out. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. Holt's voice echoed in my mind, his warning still fresh. "You should have left." He had known this place held a darkness, a hunger that would claim anyone foolish enough to venture too far. And now it was too late to turn back. But in that moment of panic, something inside me shifted. A realization that had been slowly building over the past few days. The fear, the anger, the helplessness began to crystallize into something more. I had been trained to protect the wilderness, to preserve it, to understand its delicate balance. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about respect. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees, animals, and cryptids. It was a living, breathing entity. And I had been blind to that, treating it like a battlefield instead of a sacred space. I had never understood the true depth of the land I was entrusted to protect. In that moment, I understood what we had to do. We had to earn the forest's respect. We had to leave, but not just physically. We had to leave it in peace. We had to stop fighting against it, stop trying to conquer it. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we need to give it what it wants. We need to leave, but not just our bodies. Our hearts, our intentions." She looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion, but something in my voice seemed to reach her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "The forest," I said. "We've been treating it like something to conquer, something to overcome. But it's not. It's alive, and it has power. We need to respect that power." Dean, who had been standing a few feet away, now looked over at me. His face was grim, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He understood. He had seen the truth, too, even if he couldn't quite articulate it. "We're not leaving until we've made things right," he said, his voice steady, though it was clear he was trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. But I knew we were running out of time. The creature was getting closer, and there was no way to outfight it. Our weapons weren't going to save us. Only understanding, only respect could. The forest was angry, but it wasn't just mindless rage. It was a response to our intrusion. It had seen our arrogance, our assumption that we could tame it, understand it, and it had responded in kind. The creature wasn't just a guardian. It was a messenger, an agent of the land, a reminder that we were guests, not conquerors. "We need to apologize," I said, my voice firm but calm. "We need to acknowledge the forest, acknowledge the force that's here, and beg for its forgiveness." Sarah and Dean exchanged uncertain glances, but I could see the resolve beginning to form in their eyes. Slowly, cautiously, they dropped their weapons. We knelt together, facing the heart of the forest, our heads bowed in silent reverence. The air around us grew heavier, the tension still thick, but it was different now. It wasn't the weight of impending death, it was the weight of understanding. The forest had claimed its space, and we had to surrender to it. And then, in the stillness of that moment, the growl faded. The creature, or whatever it was, receded back into the shadows. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting, leaving behind only the rustling of the trees. We had done it. We had survived, not by fighting, but by surrendering. We had learned that true strength lay in respecting the land, not trying to overpower it. In the days that followed, we left the park, never to return. We had seen its power, its force, and we knew better than to ever challenge it again. But we left changed, different from the men and women who had arrived weeks before. The wilderness had taught us humility, and in doing so, it had taught us how to survive. The forest, it seemed, was a place of vengeance, but also of understanding. And in that understanding, we found peace. The days leading up to the climax of our ordeal were filled with a sense of mounting dread, a quiet anticipation that felt like the calm before a storm. We had survived this long, but every moment in the dense, ominous woods of the Smoky Mountains National Park felt like a fleeting gift, and I knew deep down that our time was running out. The creature, whatever it was not content to merely watch from the shadows anymore. We had felt its presence grow stronger, closer. It no longer lurked quietly on the edge of our awareness. No, it had begun to push, to prod, to test us, and we had failed every time. Dean and Sarah were more on edge with each passing day. Dean's bravado had slipped. and I could see the cracks forming in his ironclad exterior. The first night we heard its growl, a low, guttural sound from the depths of the forest. I thought we might not make it through. The terror in Sarah's eyes had been palpable. But we had survived that night, and every night after, we grew a little more used to the sense of being hunted. Yet, in the back of my mind, I knew this could not last. The forest was a living, breathing entity. I had felt its pulse the moment we stepped into its domain, and now it was closing in on us. The mountain, the trees, the shadows, they were all part of something much bigger than us, something that was far older and wiser. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had overstayed our welcome. "Jimmy," Dean muttered one morning, his voice tight with anxiety, "we can't keep running. We have to face it." I nodded grimly, not trusting myself to speak. I could hear the edge in his voice, a mixture of fear and something darker, resentment. We had been running, yes, but there was nowhere to run anymore. The forest had surrounded us completely. We had reached a point where every step forward led us deeper into the abyss, and I was beginning to realize the hard truth. There was no escaping this place. Sarah was still trying to hold on to some semblance of optimism, but I could tell she was beginning to lose her grip. Her eyes were hollow, her body tense, constantly on alert for the next sign of danger. I had to admit, I wasn't faring much better. There was a crushing weight on my chest, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The forest was alive, and it was watching us. I had spent years in the wilderness, observing nature's rhythms, its cycles. But this was different. The Smoky Mountains were not just a collection of trees and creatures. It was a living, breathing entity, a place where the rules of the natural world seemed to break down. And whatever it was that watched us from the shadows of these ancient woods, it was not something that followed any rules. We couldn't fight it, and we couldn't run. We had no choice but to stand our ground and face whatever came next. That afternoon, as the sun began to set and the shadows stretched longer, we set up a new camp. Our previous camps had been abandoned hastily in the middle of the night, our supplies left behind in the scramble to escape. But now there would be no more running. This time we would face it. The tension in the air was thick, and even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees, but it was a sound that seemed to be almost mocking, as if the forest knew what was coming. "We need a plan," Sarah said quietly, her voice a thin thread of calm. I glanced at her, and then at Dean. We had been so consumed by fear, by the instinct to survive, that we hadn't stopped to consider the full scope of the situation. Now, with nowhere else to go, we needed to do more than just survive. We needed to end this. But how? "There's a shrine," I said, my voice uncertain. "A place deep in the forest. It's an old site. Some of the locals say it's a place where the boundary between worlds is thin." Dean looked at me, his brow furrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" "It's a place of worship. Ancient pre-Columbian," I explained. "I've heard of it in old maps, but I never thought I'd actually find it. If this forest is alive in the way I think it is, if it's a place of power, then this shrine might be the key." There was a long pause, and I saw both Sarah and Dean exchange glances. Part of me wondered if I was grasping at straws, if I was fooling myself, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that had been growing inside me. The forest was older than I had ever understood, and perhaps the shrine, this place of power, was where we needed to go to confront the forces that had been hunting us. "We'll go tomorrow," I said finally. "At dawn, we make our way to the shrine." Dean's lips tightened, but he nodded. He was no longer questioning my decision. He knew we had no choice. That night, as we huddled around the campfire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark beyond the circle of light. I had spent enough time in the wilds to recognize the feeling of being observed, but this was different. This wasn't just some animal tracking us. This was something intelligent, something patient. The forest was waiting for us to make our move. And tomorrow we would either face it, or be consumed by it. The weight of what we were about to do was immense. In the darkness of the night, I could feel the eyes of the forest on us, and I knew deep in my bones that everything we had done up until this point had led us to this moment. We had trespassed, we had provoked, and now we were about to walk into the heart of its power. The time for running was over. Tomorrow, we would confront whatever lay in the depths of the Smoky Mountains. The first rays of dawn pierced through the thick canopy of trees as we set out towards the shrine. The air was still, unnaturally quiet, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The weight of the trees above us felt heavier with each step, pressing down on our shoulders, their branches twisting into shapes that looked too deliberate, too unnatural to be mere happenstance. The trail ahead was unclear, the path lost to time and overgrowth, but I knew the direction well enough to push forward. Sarah and Dean followed behind me, their faces set in grim determination. Sarah's hand gripped the old map I had found in my studies, the only hint of guidance in this chaotic wilderness. Dean's eyes darted around nervously, his grip on his rifle tight and unwavering. We were no longer sure what was real and what was merely a product of our fear, but I could feel the primal pull of the forest, urging us deeper into its heart. By midday, we had reached the clearing. The shrine was ancient, overgrown with ivy and moss, its stones weathered by centuries of exposure to the elements. The air around it was thick with an eerie stillness, an unnatural quiet that seemed to amplify every sound. Even the wind had ceased. The oppressive silence was deafening. We stood at the edge of the clearing, hesitant, afraid to cross the threshold. "This is it," I said, my voice hoarse. "This is the place." Dean looked at me with suspicion, but there was no turning back now. The forest had already begun to close in around us, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The shadows between the trees seemed darker than they should be, and the air grew colder with each passing second. We had reached the eye of the storm, and I could feel the presence of the thing that had been hunting us for days, perhaps longer, pressing in on us. "We need to act fast," I whispered. "Whatever is watching us is getting closer. We need to make an offering to the forest, acknowledgement of its power. Maybe then it will leave us alone." Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "What kind of offering?" I thought back to the stories I had read, the myths surrounding places like this. "Anything. Something personal. Something that connects you to this place. Something that shows respect." The ground beneath our feet trembled slightly, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The earth was alive, as if responding to our presence. Dean muttered under his breath, "This doesn't feel right, Jimmy. What if this is a trap? What if we're feeding it instead of appeasing it?" But his words were cut off by the sound, a low growl, distant but unmistakable. The ground trembled again, this time more forcefully. I looked over at Sarah and Dean. Fear was written across their faces, and the tension was unbearable. We had been hunting cryptids for days now, but nothing had prepared us for the reality of what we were facing. This wasn't a creature of flesh and blood. This was something older, something beyond our comprehension. And then we saw it, emerging from the trees at the far edge of the clearing. Something large, towering, and twisted stepped into the open. Its form was difficult to make out in the shadows, but its glowing eyes burned with a fiery intensity that paralyzed me in place. I couldn't breathe. The air had gone cold, and the world seemed to fall away as the creature's presence filled the space. It was watching us, studying us, and I felt as though it could read every thought, every weakness within us. It was alive in a way I couldn't fully understand. Its form seemed to shift with each blink, as if it wasn't bound by the laws of physics. The trees around it seemed to lean away, as though they too recognized its dominance. "Run!" Dean shouted, snapping me out of my stupor. But it was too late. The creature lunged, its massive form propelling forward with terrifying speed. In a flash, it was upon us. I barely had time to react. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her out of the way, but Dean wasn't so lucky. The creature's claws slashed across his side, and he screamed in agony. Blood spilled into the dirt, staining the ground where we stood. I tried to pull him away, but the creature's attention was already shifting, its eyes glowing brighter. It was not just a predator. It was a force of nature, something that had lived here for centuries, maybe millennia. And we were nothing more than intruders. As the creature advanced toward us, I felt the weight of the forest closing in around me. I realized then that we were not merely facing a cryptid. This was something tied to the very fabric of the land, a guardian, a manifestation of the forest's ancient power. It wasn't hunting us out of malice. It was hunting us because we had disturbed its domain. The beast roared again, the sound shaking the trees. And in that instant, something inside me snapped. Fear turned into something else, something I had never felt before. A fierce, primal instinct kicked in. I was not just a man standing in the middle of a forest. I was part of this land, born from it, shaped by it. The same blood that ran through the trees ran through me. "Run, Sarah!" I shouted, pulling her toward the shrine. There was no time for second thoughts. We had to make it to the shrine, to the place that held the forest's power. It was our only chance. But as I looked back over my shoulder, I saw the creature moving toward us. It was relentless, an embodiment of the forest's wrath, and it would stop at nothing to ensure that we did not leave. We reached the shrine, but the beast was almost upon us. We had no choice but to face it. As it lunged again, I prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to ensure Sarah's survival. But in the final moment, a strange force erupted from the shrine, a blinding light that enveloped the creature. The forest roared with power, and then silence. The creature was gone. As I sit here, far from the mountains of Alaska, the weight of what happened still lingers. It's been years since I was sent on that ill-fated mission to eliminate the cryptids lurking in the remote wilderness, but I can't escape the haunting memories. The things I saw in those mountains, the creatures that defied logic and nature, they changed me. The peacefulness I once found in the forest, the calm of the wilderness, has been shattered forever. The very place that once felt like home now feels alien, haunted by the shadows of my mistakes. I remember the cold, the constant, numbing chill that crept into my bones, regardless of how many layers I wore. But the cold was the least of my concerns. I had no idea what I was walking into when they sent me. No one truly knew. The higher-ups in the government said it was just another mission, but I was naive, inexperienced. The cryptids weren't just myths or exaggerated stories to frighten campers. They were real, and they were dangerous. The first night we set camp near the edge of the forest, things were already off. The birds had gone silent, and the wind, usually so constant in the Alaskan wilderness, felt unnatural. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. My team and I laughed it off, chalking it up to nerves and the isolation of being in such a remote place. We set up our camp, made our meals, and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up our spines. But then came the noises. At first, they were subtle. A rustle in the trees, a faint growl in the distance. But as the night wore on, it became clearer. The creatures were near, and they were watching us. I remember looking up from my tent that night, the faint moonlight casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. I thought I saw something move between the trees, a figure far too large to be a bear, too fast to be anything I recognized. My heart raced, but I held my breath and told myself it was just my imagination. But then it wasn't. By morning, our supplies had been torn apart. Equipment was missing, tents were shredded. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching us, it was toying with us, luring us deeper into its territory. One by one, we began to disappear. In those moments, I realized we were not the hunters. We were the prey. I thought I could survive, that the experience I had as a forest ranger would be enough to keep me safe. But nothing could prepare me for what I encountered. These creatures were not merely animals, they were predators of an entirely different kind. They were intelligent, calculating, and terrifyingly fast. The mountains seemed to come alive, the ground beneath our feet shifting, as if the very forest itself was out to get us. It didn't take long before I was alone. The others, those who had trusted me to lead them, were gone. I heard their screams, the twisted wails that echoed through the trees, but I couldn't reach them in time. I tried to fight back, to make a stand, but it was futile. I didn't have the firepower to take on these monsters. And when I realized the truth, that these creatures were not just hunting us, but protecting something much more dangerous, it was too late. I ran. I ran as far as I could, through the wilderness, desperate to escape the hell I had walked into. But the forest wasn't done with me. It haunted me, replaying the horrors of that mission, the faces of my fallen comrades, the twisted shapes of the creatures lurking in the shadows. Now, as I sit here, miles away from the Alaskan wilderness, I can't forget what I saw. I can't forget the faces of the creatures, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their bodies far too grotesque to comprehend. They're still out there, waiting, and I know deep down that they will never let me go. I've been marked by something ancient, something evil, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the memories. The mountains have claimed me, and now I am a part of their curse. I failed in my mission, and worse, I failed the ones who trusted me. I can't undo what happened. I can't save them. All I can do is live with the guilt, the fear, and the lingering knowledge that I'll never be free of those mountains. The cryptids, the creatures of the dark, are not done with me, and they never will be. I may have escaped their territory, but they've left their mark. I'll never be the same again. The man who walked into those mountains is gone. What remains is someone who knows too much, someone who has seen things no human should ever have to witness. And I carry the weight of those memories every day, as the shadows continue to stalk me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The forest doesn't forget, and neither will I. Months have passed since I left the mountains of Alaska, but the nightmares still follow me. The cryptids, the creatures I once thought were myths, are now a permanent part of my life, haunting my every waking moment. I've tried to warn others, to speak about the horrors I witnessed, but no one believes me. They think I'm just another crazy survivor of a failed mission. But deep in the woods, those creatures wait. I know this now. They never stop. And the worst part is, I don't think I'm the only one who's been marked. The mountains own me. If you ever find yourself drawn to the wilderness, especially the remote and untamed areas like the Alaskan mountains, heed this warning. Some places are better left unexplored. The creatures lurking in the shadows are real, and they're not the stuff of fantasy. Trust the survivors, trust the stories passed down, and never underestimate the dangers that lie beyond the safety of civilization. Don't make the same mistake I did. Stay away from the unknown, for some mysteries are better left unsolved. Your curiosity could cost you more than you ever imagined. Stay safe and stay away.